He paid $100 for a rusted shell that everyone called garbage, and it nearly got him killed. Wade Mercer had already lost everything a man could lose: his wife, his career, his name in a town that forgot him the moment he came home. All he had left was an 8-year-old boy who still believed his father was invincible, and a garage that smelled like motor oil and old grief. Then one gray morning he dragged home a car that hadn't moved in 30 years, and the wrong people noticed. Some wanted to buy it, some wanted to bury it, and one very dangerous man wanted to make sure Wade never finished what he started. Watch until the end, hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The storm came in off the lake around 2 in the morning, dragging cold air down from Canada and dumping it across the valley, like the sky had finally run out of patience. By the time the first serious rain started cracking against the windows of Wade Mercer's garage, he was already awake, lying on his back beneath a 1972 Triumph Bonneville with a flashlight clenched between his teeth and grease up to his elbows. He'd been awake most nights lately, not because of the bike. The bike was fine. A straightforward carb rebuild for a guy named Denton who lived 2 streets over and paid in cash, always on time, never asked questions. The bike wasn't the problem. The problem was the quiet. The particular kind of quiet that filled the house after Eli fell asleep. When there was nothing left between Wade and the version of his own life, he was still trying to figure out how to live. He tightened a bolt he'd already checked twice, then slid out from under the Triumph and sat up on the cold concrete floor, wiping his hands on the rag tucked into his belt. The garage was the size of a double bay, which was generous by the standards of Kellerton, Ohio, a town that hadn't had much to offer for the better part of 30 years. The steel mill had closed when Wade was a kid. The automotive plant hung on until he was in high school, then it didn't. What was left was a specific kind of stubborn. People who stayed not because the town gave them reasons to, but because leaving felt like admitting something they weren't ready to admit. Wade understood that feeling better than most. He'd come back from his second deployment with a bad left knee, a hearing issue in his right ear that the VA kept losing paperwork about, and a wife named Claire who had somehow loved him through 2 years of the worst version of himself. They'd made a life here. Small house on Garrett Street, a leaking garage that Wade spent 3 weekends re-roofing himself, a son born in a thunderstorm in October, which Claire said was a sign of something, though she never specified what. She died 14 months ago. Ovarian cancer, the kind that moved fast and didn't negotiate. Eli was 6 when the diagnosis came. He was 7 when they buried her. Wade didn't talk about it. Not to his neighbors, not to the guys he occasionally drank with at Rooney's Bar on Route 9. He went through a period of 2 or 3 months where he didn't talk much about anything at all, and the town, to its limited credit, mostly left him alone with it. The rain got louder. He could hear it on the metal roof of the garage, a rolling, insistent sound that was almost pleasant if you didn't think too hard about what it meant for the leak in the corner by the tool chest. He got up, checked the clock on the wall. 3:15. He should sleep. He had to get Eli to school at 7:30, had to pick up a gasket set from Terry's Auto by 9, had 2 more bikes lined up behind the Triumph that weren't going to fix themselves. He should sleep. Instead, he pulled a beer from the mini fridge he kept plugged in beside the workbench, sat down on the rolling stool, and turned on the old Sanjin radio that had belonged to his grandfather. It picked up a blues station out of Cleveland. Not clearly, there was static around the edges of everything, but clearly enough. Some slow, crawling guitar work over a walking bass line. The kind of music that didn't ask anything of you. He sat there and drank his beer and listened to the rain and didn't think about anything in particular. He found the car on a Thursday. Terry Galt, who ran the parts shop, but also had an arrangement with 3 different salvage yards in the county, had mentioned it in passing the week before. Some kind of vintage coupe buried under a canvas tarp at Harriman's scrapyard off Route 12, been sitting there so long that the tarp had rotted onto the body in patches. The owner of the yard, a permanently exhausted man named Phil Harriman, wanted it gone. It was taking up space he needed for a pile of crushed minivans. Terry told Wade about it the way you tell someone about a thing you think is worthless. Figured you might want to poke around it before he crushes it. Probably nothing. Wade drove out on a Thursday morning while Eli was in school. The scrapyard was 8 miles east of town, past the old grain elevator and the stretch of Route 12, where the guardrail had been broken for so long that someone had zip-tied a reflective streamer to it as a joke. The sky was the color of dirty dishwater. There was a cold smell in the air that was almost spring, but not quite. The season hadn't committed. Phil Harriman met him at the gate with a coffee thermos and a tired expression. "Back corner," he said, pointing, "under the blue tarp, or what used to be blue." Wade walked. The yard was organized in the loose way that all scrap yards are organized, which is to say it wasn't, really, but Phil knew where everything was, and that made it functional enough. Crushed cars stacked 4 high, rows of stripped trucks, a mountain of radiators near the east fence. The car was in the back, wedged between a demolished panel van and a pile of old commercial refrigeration units. The tarp was nearly black with age, stuck to whatever was underneath in long, irregular patches. Wade crouched down and peeled back a corner from the front quarter panel. Rust. Serious rust. The kind that had been developing for decades. A deep red-orange crust over what had once been a dark paint, almost black or very dark blue. Hard to tell. The bodywork, though, even through the deterioration, had a shape to it. A deliberate shape. Sweeping lines. Low roof line. The kind of proportions that didn't happen by accident. He peeled more of the tarp away. Long hood. Short rear deck. The windshield had a crack running from the top left corner most of the way across, but the glass was still in the frame. The grille was dented but intact. The wheel arches had a muscular flare that most production cars of any era hadn't come close to. He walked around it slowly. The rear end was obscured by the accumulated grime of 3 decades, but the tail lamps had an unusual design. Elongated housings, a horizontal strip configuration, not a stock unit from anything he recognized off the top of his head. He leaned in close to the driver's door. Rust on the hinges, naturally, but the door itself. He ran his finger along a seam near the belt line. Uneven. Not from damage. From fabrication. Someone had made this panel by hand. Phil appeared behind him, refilling his thermos from a truck he kept parked by the fence. "You know what it is?" Wade asked. Phil shrugged. "Car. Old one." "Where'd it come from?" "Estate sale, maybe 8 years ago. Old property up in Moorfield. House sat empty for years before somebody in the family finally dealt with it. They sold everything. I bought the lot." He took a long sip of coffee. "Never had a title for it, which is why I never bothered moving it. Just been sitting." "How much?" Phil looked at the car. Looked at Wade. Made the assessment that Phil Harriman had spent 30 years making, which was, how much trouble is this thing going to cause me versus how much is it going to cost to crush it? $100, he said. "And you haul it yourself." He got home with it around 2 in the afternoon, using a borrowed flatbed trailer and a come-along winch to load the thing. 2 of the tires held air when he pumped them up, which was a minor miracle, and probably the only one he was going to get from this project. He was still wrestling it off the trailer in his driveway when Sandra Mack came out of the house across the street. Sandra Mack was not a bad person, exactly. She was the specific kind of neighbor who meant well in the way that sometimes made things worse. She was in her 50s, recently divorced, and had a habit of standing on her porch and observing things that were technically none of her business, while believing sincerely that she was being helpful. She watched him work for a moment, arms crossed against the cold. "Wade?" she called across the street. What is that?" "Car," he said. Are you bringing that into the neighborhood?" He didn't answer right away because he was busy with the come-along and didn't have the attention to spare. "Because it looks like it belongs in a junkyard," she said. "I mean, I'm not trying to be rude, but—" She paused. "Does Eli know you spent money on that?" He finally got the nose of the car off the trailer skids and guided it down onto the driveway. He straightened up and looked at Sandra. "Yep," he said. "I just think, with a young child, especially after everything—" She trailed off in a way that was clearly meant to communicate something she wasn't quite saying. "He needs stability, Wade, not—" She gestured at the car. "Projects." Wade looked at the car, looked back at Sandra. "I'll keep it in the garage," he said, and he started pushing it up the driveway. He heard her say something else behind him, softer, possibly to herself. Something about some people never learning. He didn't turn around. Eli got home at 3:45 off the school bus, dropped his backpack in the mudroom, and went straight to the garage the way he always did. He had learned by now that this was where his father could be found on any afternoon that didn't involve a school pickup or a supply run, and he had long since made peace with the smell of grease and the perpetual half-light in a way that some kids might not have. He stood in the garage doorway and stared at the car for a long moment. Wade was underneath it on the creeper, looking at the undercarriage. "Dad," Eli said. "Yeah." "Is that a car?" "It's a car." Eli walked closer. He was small for 8, with Claire's dark eyes and a way of being careful before he spoke that Wade had always quietly admired. He circled the car the same way Wade had done at the scrapyard, slowly, taking it in from different angles. "It's really rusty," Eli said. "It is. Did you buy it?" $100. A pause. Wade could hear his son thinking. "Is it worth $100? "I think so." Another pause. Eli pressed his hand flat against the side of the car, feeling the pitted, oxidized surface of the body panel. He left it there for a moment. "It looks like a ghost," he said. Wade slid out from under the car and looked up at his son. Eli was looking at the car with that careful, serious expression he sometimes got. The one that made him look older than 8, the one that occasionally made Wade's chest do something he couldn't quite describe. "Mom used to tell me a story," Eli said, "about a ghost rider. A person who rides so fast they become part of the wind." He ran his finger along the car's hood. "I think that's what this is. I think this is Ghost Rider." Wade sat up on the creeper. "That's what you want to call it?" Eli looked at him seriously. "It's the right name." Wade looked at the car. Decades of rust. Cracked glass. Rotted tarp stains on what had once been a finished surface. A body that someone had built with their hands. A machine that had been forgotten so thoroughly it ended up sold for $100 in a county scrapyard. "Ghost Rider," he said. "Okay." He started the teardown the next weekend. Claire's sister came and took Eli for the Saturday, which meant Wade had 10 uninterrupted hours to get under the skin of something. He started at 8 in the morning with a cup of bad coffee and the kind of silence that was almost companionable. First things first. He pulled the driver's door and set it against the garage wall. The interior was worse than he'd expected. The seats had been stripped at some point, probably for salvage value, leaving bare floor pans that were rusted but structurally intact. The dash was original, or what was left of it. The gauge cluster was missing. The steering wheel was still there, though the leather wrap had long since turned to crumbling, blackened fragments. He photographed everything before he touched it. Methodical. The way they taught him to approach equipment in the service. Document the state before you disturb it, because once you start working, you can't undo what you see. The engine bay was under 6 inches of accumulated debris. Leaves, rodent nests, what appeared to be the remains of at least one bird. He cleared it carefully and found himself standing very still for a moment afterward. The engine block was not stock. It was an inline 6, not unusual for the era, whatever era this was, but it had been modified, extensively. The cylinder head was a custom unit, not a production casting. He could see machined surfaces where the porting had been opened up, work that required a level of precision that was beyond amateur hours. The intake manifold had been fabricated. He could see the weld seams, in a configuration that suggested someone had spent real time thinking about airflow. He crouched and looked along the chassis rails. Hand-welded reinforcements at the key stress points. Suspension pickup points. Firewall junction. Not the work of a factory. The work of an engineer. He stood back and looked at the whole engine bay together. Someone had built this car. Not assembled it from a catalog, not modified a production platform. Built it, designed it, and built it by hand, piece by piece, with a level of thought and skill that you didn't encounter in a county scrapyard. He picked up his camera and started photographing the engine bay in detail. Over the following 2 weeks, he worked every evening after Eli was in bed and every available Saturday, and the picture got stranger the deeper he dug. The body panels were steel, but the thickness varied in a way that indicated deliberate engineering. Thicker at structural areas, lighter at cosmetic ones, long before that kind of variable gauge engineering became common in production vehicles. The rear suspension geometry was unusual, a configuration he'd never seen before on a road car, something between a production design and a purpose-built racing setup. He found a plate stamped to the inside of the firewall, partially obscured by the years of grime. He spent 40 minutes cleaning around it with a soft brush and a solvent rag before he could read it. It was a serial number, a long alphanumeric string, and below it, 3 initials, RFH. He wrote it down in the notebook he'd started keeping. He also found, welded to the underside of the dashboard support, a small data plate of the kind engineers sometimes attach to experimental vehicles. The stamped text was faint, but readable with the right light. Prototype. Crow Racing Development. Batch 1, Unit 1. He stared at that plate for a long time. He took a photograph of it. Then he went inside, made himself a drink he didn't quite finish, and opened his laptop. Crow Racing Development. The search didn't return much at first. An old magazine article from a racing publication, 1971. A brief mention in a motorsport history database. A name, Damian Crow, former SCCA racer and team manager based in Ohio. Another name kept appearing in the adjacent articles. Raymond F. Hollister, engineer. Brief biography, born 1931, died 1974. Worked independently, no major corporate affiliation. Described in one passage as a technical visionary whose work was decades ahead of its time. Died 1974. Wade sat back and looked at the ceiling of his kitchen. The car had been built by a dead man. The first offer came on a Tuesday morning. Wade was out front checking the mailbox when a black BMW 5 Series pulled up at the curb. Not a car you saw often on Garrett Street. The man who got out was in his 60s, wearing a light wool coat that cost more than Wade's truck, with the kind of careful grooming that suggested someone who thought about their appearance as a professional consideration. "Mr. Mercer?" he said, and he was already moving toward Wade with a business card extended before Wade had a chance to assess the situation. "My name is Gerald Forsyth. I'm a private collector, specializing in American vintage racing heritage. I understand you've recently acquired a vehicle that might be of interest to some colleagues of mine." Wade took the card, looked at it, looked at the man. "You understand that from where?" he said. Forsyth smiled the way people smile when they're accustomed to controlling conversations. "Small community, vintage collectors, word travels. I'd love to take a look at the vehicle if you'd be willing. No obligations, purely a preliminary. It's not for sale," Wade said. A brief pause. "You haven't heard the number." "I don't need to." Forsyth kept the smile in place. "Mr. Mercer, I want to be straightforward with you. If this vehicle is what I believe it to be, you are sitting on a significant asset. I could arrange a discreet evaluation and have a preliminary offer to you within—" "Have a good morning," Wade said, and went back inside. He stood at the kitchen window and watched the BMW sit at the curb for a full 3 minutes before it pulled away. That night he found a note tucked under his garage door. A single sheet of white paper folded once. Printed text. No signature. "Stop asking questions about the car. This is friendly advice." He read it twice. Turned it over. Blank. Folded it back up and put it in the kitchen drawer where he kept his utility bills. He poured himself a drink and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the dark street. His old Army buddy Marcus Hale called him at 9:30. Marcus lived in Columbus now, did private security work, stayed in touch the way some guys from their unit did. Not frequently, but consistently. The kind of friendship that didn't require maintenance to stay functional. "Heard you've got something interesting going on," Marcus said without preamble, which was his style. "How'd you hear that?" "Danny Rourke texted me. Said Vic told him you'd turned up something that was getting people excited." Vic Sorensen was a third guy from their unit, lived 40 minutes south of Kellerton, rode a 68 Panhead he'd been building for 7 years. Wade had mentioned the car to him over the phone 2 weekends ago, mostly because Vic knew a lot about vintage race history, and Wade wanted a second opinion on the data plate. "It's getting interesting," Wade said. "You need anything?" Wade thought about the BMW at the curb. The note under the garage door. "Not yet," he said. "You'll ask if you do." It wasn't a question. "Yeah," Wade said. "I'll ask." He kept working. At night, after the note and after Marcus's call, he became more systematic about what he was looking at. He cross-referenced the serial number against the limited motorsport records available online. He posted photographs of specific components, nothing identifying the full vehicle, just components, to a vintage racing forum under an account he created for the purpose. The responses came back fast and almost uniformly stunned. The intake manifold design matched a configuration that had been written about, only theoretically, never confirmed built, in a technical paper that Hollister had presented at an engineering conference in 1969. The paper was considered speculative at the time, ahead of the state of knowledge. The rear suspension geometry was, as far as anyone on the forum could identify, unique, a configuration that the thread participants agreed would have been remarkable for its era. One forum member wrote, "This is either an extraordinary fake or it's the Hollister prototype. Given those photos, I'd bet my collection it's the latter." Another wrote, "If that car exists and is provably authentic, it doesn't have a dollar value. It has a historical value. Those are different things." Wade sat with that for a long time. He thought about Eli's hand pressed flat against the side of the car, the name his son had given it. He thought about Claire telling Eli a story about a rider who moved so fast they became the wind. He closed the laptop and went to bed and didn't sleep much. The next Saturday, Eli helped him sand. This was more Eli's initiative than Wade's. He came into the garage after breakfast and announced that he wanted to help. And since Wade wasn't sure how to say no to that, he set his son up with a block of 220 grit and a small section of the rear quarter panel and demonstrated the motion, the pressure, the direction. Eli worked with enormous seriousness. His tongue came out slightly when he concentrated. He'd done this since he was a toddler, a thing that made Wade's chest ache in the pleasant, painful way that having a kid made things ache. They worked in silence for a while. The blue station was on quietly. Outside it was cold but bright, the first real March sunlight pushing through the garage window. "Dad," Eli said. "Yeah." "Sandra Mack said you wasted money." A pause, still sanding. "She told Mrs. Petrov across the alley. I heard her." Wade kept working. "What do you think?" Eli considered this with genuine seriousness. "I think she doesn't know what it is," he said finally. "She just sees what it looks like right now. She doesn't see what it's going to be." Wade looked at his son. Eli was looking at the car, running his hand over the section he'd been sanding, where the surface was slightly smoother now, slightly cleaner, still far from anything, but different than it had been. "That's right," Wade said. "That's exactly right." 2 weeks later, without announcement or warning, a motorcycle appeared at the end of the driveway. Then another. And another. Vic Sorensen, on the panhead, with Marcus Hale behind him on a borrowed Dyna. And 2 other guys, Ray Kozlowski and Pete Briggs, both from the same unit, both with their own road histories and their own reasons for appearing on a Wednesday night on Garrett Street, Kellerton, Ohio. Wade came out of the garage, wiping his hands, and looked at them. Marcus had his arms crossed, leaning against his bike. He was a big man, broad in the shoulders, with a face that had been through a few things and showed it. He looked at Wade the way he'd always looked at Wade, straight, measuring, honest. "Word is people are making you nervous," Marcus said. "I didn't say nervous," Wade said. "You didn't say not nervous either." Wade looked at the 4 of them. Leather. Road-worn boots. 4 bikes that collectively represented about as much mechanical history as the car in his garage. Men who had seen the worst version of things and come out the other side changed but functional. "I'm not selling it," Wade said. Not because anyone had asked. Because it needed to be said out loud, to people who would hear it properly. Marcus nodded once. "Okay, I don't know exactly what it's worth. I know it's worth more than money, which sounds like something an idiot says. But I'm saying it anyway." Vic Sorensen, who was generally quiet, said, "Doesn't sound like an idiot to me." Wade looked at the garage door. Inside, under the work lights, the car was partly disassembled, panels off, engine out and on the stand, chassis exposed in a way that would have looked like destruction to someone who didn't understand what rebuilding looked like from the inside. "Come in and look at it," he said. They came in, 5 men in a garage on a cold Wednesday night. The blues station on the radio, the smell of solvent and steel, the partially dismantled remains of something that the world had forgotten, which was becoming, under the work of one man's careful hands, something it didn't yet know it remembered. They stood around the car for a long time without saying much, looking at the chassis, looking at the components laid out on the workbench, looking at the data plate that Wade had photographed and printed and pinned to the wall above the bench, next to his notebook pages. Finally, Marcus said, "What are you going to do with it when it's done?" Wade thought about Eli, about the name his son had given it, about a dead engineer named Hollister who had built something extraordinary and never seen the world recognize it. "I don't know yet," Wade said, "but I know what I'm not going to do." Nobody asked him to specify. They understood. Outside, the cold finally broke slightly. The first real thaw of the year, the temperature lifting 2 degrees to something that still wasn't warm but wasn't as relentlessly punishing. A distant dog barked. A truck passed on Route 9. Inside the garage, the radio played, and Ghost Rider waited. The thaw lasted 3 days, and then the cold came back, the way it always did in Kellerton in March. Not dramatically, just persistently, like a debt that kept getting deferred but never forgiven. Wade worked through it. He'd put in a secondary space heater in the corner of the garage, the electric kind that smelled faintly of burning dust for the first 20 minutes each evening, and he'd gotten into a rhythm that felt almost sustainable. Monday through Friday. Get Eli to school, do the pain work during the day, work on Ghost Rider after dinner until midnight or later. Saturday. Work until he couldn't see straight. Sunday. Eli's day, no garage, no exceptions. He'd made that rule for himself early, and he kept it even when he didn't want to. The paying work was keeping him functional. Barely. He had 4 bikes in the queue now, 2 regular customers and 2 new referrals. And Terry Galt was sending the occasional car his way when the shop was backed up. It wasn't prosperity, exactly, but it was movement. He paid his bills. He kept the lights on. He kept Eli fed and in reasonable clothes and enrolled in the soccer league that Claire had signed him up for before she got sick, because he wasn't going to let that slide no matter how complicated the logistics got. The forum activity around the engine photographs had gotten intense in a way that Wade was starting to find uncomfortable. He'd posted under the username Midwest Mechanic, nothing identifiable, just detailed photographs of specific components with technical questions framed neutrally. The thread had grown to 11 pages. People were arguing. Experts were weighing in. Someone had apparently reached out to a curator at a motorsport museum in Indianapolis, who had sent back a response that the forum administrator had posted with visible excitement. If these are authentic, this represents a significant historical discovery. Wade read that and closed his laptop and went back into the garage and sanded for an hour without stopping. The second offer came on a Friday afternoon. This one didn't arrive in a BMW. It arrived in a white Cadillac Escalade with tinted windows that parked at the curb for 10 minutes before anyone got out, which Wade noticed from the kitchen window and didn't like. The man who eventually emerged was younger than Forsyth. Late 40s, athletic build, the kind of tan that didn't come from Ohio in March. He wore jeans and a leather jacket that was expensive enough to look casual, and he had the specific confidence of someone who was used to things going the way he wanted. His name, he said, was Colt Reeves. He had a card, too. Everyone seemed to have a card, but this one said Reeves Heritage Acquisitions, with an address in Scottsdale, Arizona. "I'll be direct," he said, standing in Wade's driveway with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the closed garage door. "I represent a consortium of serious collectors. We've been tracking the Hollister prototype for 18 years. If what you have is what we believe it is, we're prepared to offer substantially more than market value." "How do you know what I have?" Wade said, a small smile. "Mr. Mercer, the forum posts weren't invisible. The serial number in the photos, you cropped it, but not all of it. Enough." Wade looked at him. He kept his expression even. It was a skill he developed in the service that occasionally came in handy in civilian life. "I said it to the last guy and I'll say it to you," Wade said. "It's not for sale." "You haven't heard the number." "That seems to be what everyone says." Reeves tilted his head slightly. 300,000. That's a preliminary figure, subject to authentication, which we can arrange discreetly and quickly. If the vehicle is what it appears to be, the final number is considerably higher. Wade's pulse did something at 300,000 that he'd prefer it hadn't. He was aware of his mortgage, of the secondhand quality of Eli's winter coat, of the VA paperwork still sitting in a folder on his desk that he hadn't had the energy to navigate in 2 months. He was aware of all of that, and he still heard himself say, "Not for sale." Reeves studied him for a moment. "Can I ask what you're planning to do with it?" "Not yet," Wade said. I'm still figuring that out. That's not really an answer. I know. Another pause. Reeves looked at the garage door again, the way people look at things they want and can't have, which is differently from how they look at things they just want. My number's on the card, he said. Think about it. The offer won't stay at $300,000 indefinitely. There are other interested parties, and if this goes to auction, the dynamics change. You'd be better served by a private transaction. I'll keep that in mind, Wade said. He went inside when the Escalade pulled away. He stood in the kitchen for a while looking at the card. Then he put it in the drawer with Forsyth's card and the anonymous note, and he made Eli a grilled cheese sandwich because it was 4:30 and Eli had gotten home from school 20 minutes ago and hadn't eaten since lunch. Eli sat at the kitchen table eating his sandwich and watching Wade's face with the particular attention of a child who understood that something was going on without knowing what. "Who was that man?" he said. "Wants to buy the car." Eli chewed. "Are you going to sell it?" "No." Eli nodded, satisfied by this in the immediate way that kids accepted facts, and went back to his sandwich. Wade stood at the counter and drank a glass of water and tried to get his heartbeat back to something normal. He drove out to the county library on a Saturday while Eli was at Marcus and Dana's place. Marcus's wife, Dana, had taken a shine to Eli in the way that kind women sometimes did, feeding him real food and letting him watch movies at a volume louder than Wade's house allowed. The library had a microfilm archive and a librarian named Bet Janovich who had worked there for 22 years and knew where everything was. He asked about Raymond Hollister. Bet found him 3 things: a brief obituary from the Kellerton Courier-Gazette, dated November 1974, a single-column article from 1971 about a regional engineering award that Hollister had been nominated for but not received, and a photograph, poor quality, reproduced from a motorsport event program, showing a man in his early 40s standing next to a racing car that was not Ghost Rider. The obituary was terse in the way rural obituaries often were. Raymond Francis Hollister, born 1931 in Moorfield, Ohio, self-taught mechanical engineer, worked independently, survived by no immediate family, died of cardiac arrest. A memorial service had been held. The estate had been managed by a cousin. The single column about the engineering award said more. Hollister had been nominated for work on what the article described as an experimental vehicle incorporating unconventional structural and mechanical approaches. The nomination committee had praised his innovative approach to weight distribution and engine architecture. He had not won the award. The article quoted him once, briefly, when asked about his work. "I'm not interested in what's been done before. I'm interested in what's possible." Wade read that sentence 3 times. He made a photocopy of everything and drove home. That night, after Eli was in bed, he pinned the obituary on the wall above the workbench, next to the data plate photograph and his notebook pages. He stood there looking at the wall for a while, the kind of accumulated documentation that begins to look like something when there's enough of it together. Raymond Hollister had built Ghost Rider alone, had shown it to almost no one, had died before the world had a chance to understand what he'd made, had been forgotten so thoroughly that the car ended up in a scrapyard for 3 decades before a broke mechanic from Kellerton bought it for $100 on a Thursday morning. Wade thought about that for a long time. The 3rd week of March brought with it the peculiar social pressure that small towns generate when they sense something is happening in their midst. Kellerton was a town that had been waiting for something interesting to happen for a long time, and the appearance of out-of-state vehicles on Garrett Street, the BMW, the Escalade, a dark gray Mercedes that had idled past the house twice without stopping, was giving people things to talk about at Rooney's and at the diner on Main and at the gas station on Route 9, where most information exchanges in the township occurred. Wade started getting calls from people he hadn't heard from in months, distant acquaintances. A guy he'd done a favor for 2 years ago, a former neighbor who'd moved to Cleveland but apparently still had his number. They were all very casual about it. They'd heard he had something. They knew a guy. They were just curious. Sandra Mack knocked on his door on a Tuesday evening with a casserole dish, which was a gesture of such elaborate social complexity, simultaneously a peace offering and an entry fee for conversation, that Wade stood in the doorway for a moment, genuinely unsure how to respond. He accepted the casserole. I heard there were people coming around, Sandra said, in the voice of someone who had been conducting surveillance and wished to be acknowledged for it. Yep, Wade said. Collectors? Something like that. She waited. He didn't add anything. People are saying it's worth a lot of money, she said. People don't know what they're talking about. That wasn't quite accurate, but it wasn't quite inaccurate either. The number that was circulating, he'd caught the edge of a conversation between two guys at Rooney's who'd mentioned that car on Garrett Street and something like $500,000, had gotten inflated in the way that numbers always get inflated in small towns where money is scarce and imagination is not. I just want you to know, Sandra said, with the gravity of someone delivering a considered position, that what I said before about stability, about Eli, I wasn't trying to be unkind. I know. I was concerned. I know. She looked at him. He looked back. They had the compressed, mostly unsatisfying kind of neighborhood reconciliation that adults have when they both know the apology being offered is partial, but they've both decided to accept it anyway. It's a very interesting situation, she said finally. It is, he said. He thanked her for the casserole and went back inside. The casserole was actually good. Chicken and rice, nothing fancy, the kind of food that was hard to get wrong and people made when they didn't know what else to do. He ate it, standing at the counter, and thought about Raymond Hollister, alone in a workshop somewhere outside Moorfield, building something the world wasn't ready for yet. Vic Sorensen came up from Gallia County on a Wednesday with a hard drive containing a scanned archive of SCCA documentation from the late 60s and early 70s, which he'd gotten from a contact in the motorsport historical community. They sat at the kitchen table after Eli went to bed, working through it, the laptop open between them and two beers getting warm in the March chill that still pushed through the kitchen window. Here, Vic said, pointing at a page. It was a race entry list from a regional SCCA event in 1971. Near the bottom, in the category for experimental class, Hollister, RF, vehicle, prototype, unnumbered, did not finish. Wade leaned in. One race. One I could find, Vic said. He might have done more. Records from that era are inconsistent. He scrolled. But look at this. Another document, a technical protest filed by another team at the same event. The protest objected to the Hollister vehicle being permitted to run on the grounds that several of its components could not be verified as production-derived. The protest was upheld. Hollister had been disqualified. Wade sat back. So he built something nobody had seen before, and they threw him out for it. That's what it looks like. Vic took a drink of his beer. The irony being that everything he did that got him disqualified is now what makes it historically significant. They sat with that for a moment. I found something else, Vic said, scrolling to another section of the archive. Crow Racing Development. Damian Crow. He pulled up a short biographical entry, formatted like a program note, the kind of thing race programs included. He was an SCCA regional competitor, based out of Columbus. By 1972, he'd transitioned into team management and vehicle development consulting. A pause. He knew Hollister. There's a mention here, so a quote from a 1973 article, Crow talking about engineers he admired. Hollister's name is in there. Wade looked at the screen. You think Crow knows what this car is? I think Crow might be the only person still alive who knew Hollister personally, Vic said. Beyond that, I don't know. Can you find him? Vic raised an eyebrow. The man is in his 80s if he's still alive. Let me make some calls. Nush. The form had gotten out of hand. Wade discovered this on a Thursday evening when he checked the thread and found it had grown to 23 pages and had apparently been linked to from 3 other enthusiast websites. There were posts from England, from Germany, from Japan. The discussion had moved well beyond the technical questions he'd originally posted and into territory he hadn't authorized. Speculation about location, about the identity of the current owner, about the vehicle's provenance and value. One post, by a user he didn't recognize, said, "Based on what's been shared here, I believe I know which yard this came from and who acquired it. Happy to DM interested parties." He stared at that for a moment. Then he deleted his account. The thread would keep running without him, he knew. He couldn't put that back in the bottle. But he removed himself from it and felt slightly better for doing it, even knowing it was largely symbolic. He was in the garage an hour later when he heard the motorcycle. Not multiple motorcycles, just one, idling slowly past on Garrett Street, the note of the engine deliberate and unhurried. He stepped to the garage door and looked out through the gap. A single bike, a big cruiser, dark paint, not a rider he recognized. It went past without stopping, but it went past slowly, and the rider turned his head toward the house. Wade stood there after it had gone, listening to the sound of it fading down the street. He went back inside and texted Marcus. Somebody doing slow passes on the street, single bike. Marcus texted back 45 seconds later. I'll handle it. He didn't ask what that meant. Oh, the progress on Ghost Rider was real. That was the thing he kept coming back to when the rest of it got loud. The actual work was happening, and it was going well. He'd gotten the engine out and on the stand, and what he'd found when he properly disassembled it was even more remarkable than the external examination had suggested. The cylinder head had porting work that was meticulous, not just opened up, but shaped, profiled, optimized in a way that required both knowledge and patience and a willingness to experiment. The combustion chambers had been reshaped by hand. The valvetrain geometry was modified in a manner that would have required Hollister to essentially derive the correct specifications himself, since nothing commercially available would have fit. He could see the mind in it. That was what was strange. He'd rebuilt a lot of engines in his life, Army vehicles, motorcycles, everything in between, and most engines, even good ones, were the result of institutional engineering, systematic, functional, competent. This one felt like it had a personality. The decisions it represented weren't conservative. They were the decisions of someone who had a theory about how things should work and was absolutely prepared to machine custom parts and fabricate his own components to test that theory. Wade spent a full Saturday evening just examining the head, photographing it, making notes. At one point, Eli appeared at the garage door in his pajamas, which meant it was after 10 and Wade had lost track of time again. "You're supposed to be asleep," Wade said. "I couldn't." Eli padded over to the engine on the stand and looked at it the way he always looked at it, with a seriousness that no 8-year-old should probably have. "Does it work?" "Not yet. It will." "How do you know?" "Because I can see what was wrong with it, and what was wrong with it isn't permanent." Eli thought about this. "Like when something breaks," he said. "But it's not broken forever. It's just broken for now." Wade looked at his son. The work light threw long shadows across the garage. The Blue Station was playing something slow, something almost wordless, just guitar work over a brushed snare. "Yeah," he said, "like that." Eli leaned against his father's side, which was a thing he did sometimes without announcement. Just leaned in, accepting contact, giving it. Wade put his arm around the boy's shoulders. They stood there looking at the engine together. "I told my teacher about Ghost Rider," Eli said. "What did she say?" "She said it sounded interesting. She asked if it was really worth a lot of money." A pause. "I said I didn't care about that." "What do you care about?" Eli considered the question. "I care that it's going to run again," he said. "It's been broken for a long time. It should get to run again." Wade tightened his arm around his son's shoulders. "Go back to bed," he said, his voice slightly rougher than he'd intended. "Okay." Eli peeled away and headed for the door, then stopped. "Dad." "Yeah." "When it runs again, say, 'Can I be there?' You'll be the first person I call." Marcus showed up on a Friday with Ray Kozlowski, and they told him about the slow-pass biker. His name was Garrett, apparently, no last name confirmed, and he worked for a man named Dennis Stahl, who was one of the principals behind a vintage car consortium operating out of Pittsburgh. Stahl was, according to Marcus's characterization, the kind of guy who's technically legal but enjoys being at the edge of things. He collected intimidation the way other people collected cars. Not for any specific immediate threat, but to create an atmosphere. "He's done this before," Marcus said. They were in the kitchen. Eli was at Dana's again. Found something someone had, created pressure, made the sale happen on terms that weren't the seller's terms, usually with people who don't have the support structure to push back. "He figured I was isolated," Wade said. "He figured right, until he didn't," Ray said. Ray was short and wide with forearms that looked like they'd been assembled from structural components, And he had the calm of someone who had been in enough serious situations that moderately serious situations no longer moved the needle much. We had a conversation with Garrett. What kind of conversation? Marcus shrugged. The kind where we explain the situation clearly and give the other party the opportunity to make a good decision. Wade looked at him. You didn't. Nobody got touched, Marcus said, with a slight edge of mild offense. We're not 22 anymore, Wade. We just made it clear that the situation here is not isolated, that there are people aware of what's happening, and that attempts at pressure would be met with appropriate response. A beat. Garrett seemed to understand. I think Stahl will understand, too. Wade sat back. He was aware of the complicated feeling of accepting help from people who were willing to go places he couldn't quite go himself. And he was also aware that the complicated feeling was mostly ego, and that his son's safety was more important than his ego. I owe you, he said. No, Marcus said, in a tone that closed the subject. Tech, Vic called on a Sunday afternoon. I found Damien Crow, he said. Wade was quiet for a moment. Is he alive? Very much. 83 years old, lives in a farmhouse outside Granville. Still goes to vintage racing events occasionally, according to someone I talked to who knows someone. A pause. He's not exactly friendly to strangers, from what I understand. Independent man. Old school. Does he know about the car? About what I found? I didn't tell him anything. I just confirmed he exists and where. The rest is yours if you want it. Wade sat with this. Outside, the first real birds of spring were in the oak tree in the backyard, making their small, determined sounds. The snow was mostly gone from the lawn now, leaving behind the particular grayish-brown of March grass, flattened and tired-looking, but still alive underneath. I want it, Wade said. Then go see him, Vic said, but go careful. A man that age, that private, you can't go in there with demands or a pitch. You just go honest and see what he gives you. When did you get wise? I've been wise, Vic said. You just haven't been paying attention. He went on a Tuesday because Tuesdays were the slowest day for the garage, and he could shift his paying work to the afternoon. He left Eli with a neighbor who owed him a favor, loaded the photographs in his notebook into a manila envelope, and drove 52 miles on back roads through the greening Ohio countryside to a farmhouse outside Granville that sat behind a white fence that had been good once and was still adequate. There was a truck in the driveway. Old, not neglected, the kind of old that was the result of maintenance rather than abandonment. There was a dog that barked twice and then lost interest. There was a porch that someone had swept recently. He knocked. The man who answered the door was old in the way that some men get old. Not diminished, exactly, but densely inhabited. He was lean, with a face that had spent decades near engines and in weather, and he had eyes that were still sharp in the way that sharp eyes stay sharp even when everything around them shifts. He looked at Wade without speaking. Mr. Crow, Wade said, my name is Wade Mercer. I'm a mechanic from Kellerton. I found something I think you might know about, and I drove out here because I didn't know who else to talk to. Crow looked at him for a long moment. He had the unhurried quality of a man who had learned that most things that seemed urgent were not, and that the things that were actually urgent didn't announce themselves immediately. What did you find? He said. A car, Wade said. A prototype. It had a data plate. Crow Racing Development. Something moved across the old man's face. Not surprise exactly, more like the shift of something that had been stored under pressure for a long time, beginning to find a way out. You'd better come inside, he said. Hotat. Crow's kitchen was the kitchen of someone who had lived alone for years but hadn't stopped taking care of the place. Clean, modest. A bookshelf visible through the doorway to the next room that was stacked with racing programs and technical manuals alongside ordinary books. On the wall, 2 photographs. A race car, unfamiliar model, 1960s by the look of it, and a man standing next to a workshop, squinting into bright sunlight, wearing clothes practical for working in. Wade recognized the face from the library photograph. Hollister. 20 years younger than the obituary, but unmistakably the same. Crow made coffee without asking whether Wade wanted any, and set a cup in front of him and sat down across the table with his own. He looked at the envelope Wade had set on the table. Let me see, he said. Wade laid out the photographs, the engine components, the chassis details, the data plate, The firewall stamping with the initials RFH, the obituary. Crow looked at each one. He was quiet for a long time. His hands, wrapped around his coffee cup, had the particular stillness of someone managing something internal. Raymond, he said finally. Just the name. Not quite a statement. You knew him well, Wade said. We were close for about 6 years, Crow said. Worked on development projects together. He did the engineering. I handled the business side, such as it was. A pause. He was the smartest man I ever worked with. Not just about engines, about everything. He thought differently. He picked up the photograph of the cylinder head. He built this by hand. All of it. I know. I can see it in the work. Crow looked at him with a slight recalibration. You know what you're looking at. I'm a mechanic. I've been one since the Army. I know good work. Crow set the photograph down. After Raymond died, I tried to find the car. I knew he'd built a prototype. He called it his statement piece, his attempt to show what was possible without any institutional backing. He'd driven it once at a regional event, and they disqualified him. The old man's jaw tightened briefly. 50 years ago, and it still burns. He wasn't cheating. He was just ahead of what they could categorize. The archive shows a protest was upheld. It was political. There were people who didn't want what he was doing to be acknowledged. Crow took a long drink of his coffee. After the event, he brought the car back to his shop in Moorfield and put it away. He told me he was going to show the world in his own time, on his own terms. He died 7 months later. A pause that held weight. The cousin who handled the estate had no idea what he had. He sold everything. The car disappeared. Into a scrapyard, Wade said, where it sat for 30 years until a guy trying to free up space sold it to me for $100. Crow looked at him across the table. Can you restore it? He said. I'm halfway through, Wade said. The engine needs machine work. There are a few components that need to be remade from scratch, and I'll need someone with the right equipment. But the fundamentals are sound. He built it to last. He built everything to last, Crow said quietly. They sat there in the Tuesday morning quiet of the farmhouse kitchen. Through the window, the Ohio fields were turning the tentative green of early spring, just beginning to show what they'd been holding back all winter. There are people trying to buy it, Wade said. Collectors. One consortium out of Pittsburgh that's been applying pressure. Stahl, Crow said immediately. Wade looked at him. You know him. Dennis Stahl has been looking for that car for 15 years. He doesn't care about Raymond. He doesn't care about what it represents. He wants to own it because it's valuable, and owning valuable things is what he does. The old man's voice was flat and certain. He won't stop because you told him no. I know. Then you need to decide what you're actually going to do with it, Crow said, because leaving it in a state of undecided makes you vulnerable. Stahl knows how to work undecided. Wade looked at the photographs spread on the table, the photographs of a machine that one man had built alone, in a workshop, out of belief that what he was doing was worth doing. I know what I want, Wade said. I'm just still working out how to get there. That's usually how it works, Crow said. He stood, refilled both cups. Tell me what you want. So Wade told him. It took about 20 minutes. He talked about Eli, about Claire, about the $100 morning at Harriman's scrapyard, about the name his son had given the car and why, about what he thought it would mean for Raymond Hollister's name and work to be properly acknowledged, not just as a curiosity, but as what it actually was, the work of someone who had done something genuinely remarkable and had never gotten to see the world understand that. Crow listened without interrupting. He was a man who knew how to listen, which was rarer than most people assumed. When Wade finished, Crow was quiet for a moment. There's a man you should know about, he said. His name is Arthur Bain. He runs the Midwest Racing Heritage Museum in Columbus. He and I have known each other for 30 years. He picked up his coffee. If what you're describing is what you actually want, not money, but recognition, permanence, Arthur is the person to talk to. What would that look like? It would look like Raymond's car in a museum with his name on it, Crow said. And it would look like enough money in your pocket to make the next year of your life less of a struggle than it clearly has been. I'm not looking for charity. It's not charity. The car is worth what it's worth. Nobody says you have to leave empty-handed. The old man put down his cup. What I'm saying is that there's a way to do this that honors the work and doesn't require you to sell to people who only see an asset. A pause. if that's what you want. Wade looked at the photograph of Hollister in the sun outside his workshop. The man squinting into the light with the expression of someone who knew something nobody else knew yet, who had been patient about it because he believed eventually the world would come around. He hadn't lived long enough to see it, but the car had. "Set up the meeting," Wade said. Crow nodded slowly. He picked up the photograph of the cylinder head again and held it in the gray morning light coming through the window. "He would have liked to know someone like you found it," the old man said. He set the photograph down carefully. "Someone who could see what it was." Wade didn't answer that. He wasn't sure what to say to it. He gathered his photographs and his notebook, said goodbye to Damien Crow at the door of the farmhouse, and drove the 52 miles back to Kellerton through the greening Ohio countryside with the radio off, and his thoughts moving through the particular combination of things that had no names: grief and purpose, and the feeling that sometimes the work in front of you is the only answer available to the questions you can't ask out loud. Ghost Rider was waiting in the garage. There was still a long way to go. Arthur Bain was not what Wade expected. He'd pictured someone like Crow, lean, weathered, old school, in the specific way that men who'd spent their lives around racing tended to be. What he got instead was a heavy-set man in his late 60s with a neatly trimmed white beard and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, wearing a fleece vest over a flannel shirt that had a coffee stain on the left cuff he clearly hadn't noticed. He met Wade in the lobby of the Midwest Racing Heritage Museum on a Thursday morning and shook his hand with the grip of someone who'd been told as a young man that handshakes mattered and had never stopped believing it. "Damien called me twice," Bain said as they walked through the main gallery. "Once to tell me you were coming, and once to tell me not to lowball you. He said that second part pretty firmly." "That sounds right," Wade said. The museum was better than he'd expected for a mid-sized Columbus institution. Not a major national facility, but serious. The displays were thought through. The vehicles were properly presented with genuine contextual information rather than just year and model. A 1963 Cobra replica near the entrance that was clearly not a replica. A row of SCCA race cars along the east wall with their stories told in enough detail to be interesting rather than just informative. Bain walked with his hands in his vest pockets and the easy pace of someone on familiar ground. He'd clearly been in this building thousands of times and still didn't look tired of it. "I want to see your documentation before we talk seriously," he said. "Not because I doubt Damien, because I need to be able to stand behind whatever we agree to. My board will want to see provenance. I've got everything I found. It's not a complete chain of title. There are gaps, Phil Harriman's yard being the last documented point, but the physical evidence is substantial. Physical evidence is often more convincing than paperwork in these situations. Paperwork can be fabricated. Good engineering can't." Bain glanced at him sideways. "Damien tells me you did the disassembly yourself." "I'm still mid-restoration. Engine is out and stripped. Chassis is cleaned. Body is about 40% stripped down to bare metal." "What's the engine look like?" "Remarkable," Wade said, which was not a word he used casually about engines. Bain stopped walking. They were standing in front of a display about early American sports car racing, a wall of photographs from the 50s and early 60s, drivers in cloth helmets and goggles looking impossibly young. "Damien said the same word," Bain said. "He said you were a mechanic who understood what he was looking at. He doesn't say that about people easily." A pause. "What do you actually want out of this, Mr. Mercer?" Wade had been thinking about how to answer this question since the drive up from Kellerton. He'd worked through several versions of it, some more polished than others. And somewhere around the outskirts of Columbus, he'd decided that the polished versions were the wrong approach. "I want the car in a place where people can see it and understand what it is," he said. "I want Raymond Hollister's name on a wall that he'd have been proud to see it on. I want my son to be able to bring his kids here someday and show them something." He paused. "And I need enough money from the transaction to clear my mortgage and get out from under some things that have been pressing on me. I'm not greedy about it, but I'm not pretending I don't have needs either." Bain studied him for a moment. "That's a very straightforward answer," he said. "I've been working on it." The older man nodded slowly. "Come to my office. I want to see those photographs." They spent 2 hours in Bain's office, which smelled like old paper and motor oil in a ratio that made complete sense for the man who occupied it. Wade laid out his documentation on the desk and walked Bain through everything systematically. The scrapyard acquisition, the data plate, the firewall stamping, the engine components, the form responses from technical experts, the obituary, the engineering conference paper, the SCCA race record, and disqualification. Bain asked good questions. Precise, technical questions about the cylinder head porting, about the chassis reinforcement welds, about the suspension geometry. Wade answered them as fully as he could and said clearly when he was uncertain rather than speculating. At one point, Bain pulled out a vintage racing encyclopedia from the shelf behind his desk and opened it to a page about American independent constructors of the late 1960s and early 1970s. Hollister wasn't in it. That absence seemed to make some kind of point that neither of them stated out loud. "The authentication process will take time," Bain said finally, sitting back in his chair. "I'd want to bring in 2 independent experts, one mechanical, one historical. I'd want them to examine the vehicle in situ, at your garage, with full access." "That's fine. It will require some disruption to your space and your schedule. I can manage that." Bain laced his fingers together on the desk. "If it authenticates, and Damien's confidence plus what you're showing me here makes me think it will, the acquisition value for this institution would be substantial, not as high as a private sale to a collector might theoretically reach." He said that last part with his eyes on Wade, waiting for a reaction. "I know," Wade said. "You know that, and you're still here. Private sale to a collector means it disappears into someone's climate-controlled garage and nobody sees it again," Wade said. "That's not what I want." Bain looked at him for a long moment. "I can probably go to $5 million, subject to board approval and authentication confirmation. It's a stretch for an institution our size, but the historical significance would justify the campaign." He paused. "That number is not public. If it gets out before we close, it complicates things politically." Wade didn't flinch at the number. He'd known a number in that range was possible from the forum discussions, from Reeves's preliminary offer, and its implication of a higher final figure. He'd had weeks to make his peace with what it meant and what it didn't mean. $5 million, he said, subject to board and authentication. "What's the timeline on authentication?" 6 to 8 weeks for the expert visits and analysis. "Board meeting is the first Thursday of next month. I'd bring a preliminary recommendation then and a final one after authentication." Wade did the math. 2 months of stall and his people still circling. 2 months of keeping the situation contained. "There's a complication," he said, and told Bain about stall. Bain's expression didn't change much, but something in his posture shifted. "Dennis Stahl," he said. It wasn't quite a sigh. "He's been on the edges of things I've worked on before. He's persistent and he's patient and he's got lawyers who enjoy their work." "I've got people managing the immediate pressure," Wade said. "But 2 months is a long time." "It is," Bain said. He thought for a moment. "If we move on a letter of intent, something that establishes a formal negotiation process between you and this institution, it creates a paper record that complicates Stahl's options. He'd have to challenge a documented transaction rather than just applying informal pressure. Can you do that before the board meeting?" "I can do a preliminary letter within the week. It won't be binding, but it'll be on letterhead and it'll say what it needs to say." He looked at Wade. "I want to be transparent with you. This is a long road still. Things can go wrong. Authentication can surface complications. The board can be difficult. Stahl has lawyers, and we'd have to be careful." "I'm used to things going wrong," Wade said. "Most people who say that aren't really," Bain said, "but I have a feeling you might be." Mas. He drove back to Kellerton with the windows down even though it was cold, the April air coming in sharp and direct. He needed to think, and movement helped him think. He had the radio off again. The letter of intent would take a week. The authentication process would take 2 months. $5 million, subject to conditions that could change. A deal with a man he'd met once, brokered through an 83-year-old former racing figure, involving a car that had been sitting in a scrapyard for 30 years before it landed in his driveway. He thought about Claire. He thought about her in the specific way he'd learned to think about her over the past year and a half. Not reaching for her exactly, more like orienting toward where she would have been, the way you orient toward a window even when the light isn't coming through it directly. She would have had something precise and clarifying to say about all of this. She'd always been better than him at distinguishing between what he wanted and what he needed, What he needed was to get Eli through school in a town that still had the facilities to do it reasonably. What he needed was to not lose the house. What he needed was to keep the work coming in and the bills paid and to be present enough that his son didn't grow up understanding his father primarily as an absence. What he wanted was something harder to articulate, something that had to do with doing right by a dead engineer and a dead wife and a $100 car and a kid who saw value in things everyone else had written off. He didn't think those two things were incompatible. He was betting everything on the idea that they weren't. The problem with Stahl escalated on a Monday. Wade was at Terry's picking up parts when Terry said, with his particular version of awkward directness, "You know, someone's been asking around about you." Wade set the gasket set on the counter. "Stahl's people." Terry looked slightly surprised that Wade knew. "Guy came in last Thursday, asking about you, your history here, your financial situation, whether you had debts." A pause. "I didn't tell him anything useful." "What did he look like?" 40s, short, gray blazer, had a way of asking questions that made it sound like he was just making conversation, but everything pointed the same direction. That wasn't Reeves, by the description. Someone new. Stahl was broadening his approach, shifting from direct offers to background research, building a file. Wade thanked Terry and drove home and called Marcus. Marcus listened without interrupting, then said, "He's looking for leverage." "That's what I figured. If there's anything in your financial history that's messy, debts, anything like that, he'll try to use it, create a situation where you need cash fast and he's the available source." "My finances aren't pretty, but they're clean," Wade said. "What about the car's provenance? Anything there he could challenge?" "The title history has gaps. Harriman didn't have a title when he sold it to me. I didn't think about it at the time because I paid $100 for what I thought was scrap." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "That could be a problem if Stahl's lawyers argue the sale was improper." "The museum's legal team will have to address that," Wade said. "Bain knows about the gap. It's not a new piece of information. But if Stahl files something before you close the deal, it creates delay. And delay is his friend." Wade sat down on the kitchen chair. Through the window he could see the garage, the door closed, Ghost Rider inside in pieces that were slowly becoming a whole again. "I need that letter of intent from Bain," he said. "How soon?" "He said a week. I need to call him tomorrow and push." "Do that," Marcus said. "And Wade, don't let Eli out of your sight for the next few weeks. I'm not saying Stahl is dangerous in a physical sense, but situations get unpredictable when there's money involved and someone feels like they're losing." Wade hadn't thought about Eli directly in those terms, and the thought landed hard. "Understood," he said. After he hung up, he sat at the kitchen table for a few minutes in the evening quiet. Eli was in the living room watching TV, the sound of some animated show coming through the wall. Normal sound, ordinary Tuesday evening sound. He was aware of how much he wanted to keep it normal, how much work that was taking. He called Bain the next morning and explained the timeline pressure without overstating it, because Bain seemed like a man who responded to accuracy better than urgency. Bain listened, asked 2 questions, and said he'd have the letter to Wade by Friday. The letter arrived Thursday. It was 4 paragraphs on museum letterhead, professionally drafted by their legal department, stating that the Midwest Racing Heritage Museum was in active preliminary acquisition negotiations for the vehicle described in the attached technical summary, that the parties had agreed to an exclusivity period of 90 days, during which the seller would not enter binding agreements with other parties, and that the museum had committed to completing the authentication and board approval process within that period. Wade read it twice, made a copy, and put the original in a fireproof box he kept under the bed. Then he took a photograph of it and texted it to Marcus. Marcus texted back, "Good, show it to anyone who needs to see it." The machine work needed for the engine required someone with a proper shop. Wade had limitations. His equipment was serviceable for most things, but not for the precision machining the cylinder head components required. He needed a Bridgeport mill and someone who knew how to use it, which wasn't a common combination. He found it 40 minutes east of Kellerton in a town called Hadley, at a shop run by a man named Frank Odom, who was 70 years old, partially deaf in one ear, and had been doing precision machine work since before Wade was born. Frank's shop was the kind of place that existed in shrinking numbers. The floor worn smooth by decades of use, every surface organized with the logic of long habit, equipment that was older than most of Wade's bikes, but maintained to a tolerance that modern CNC shops occasionally didn't match. Frank took one look at the cylinder head and put on his reading glasses and stopped talking for 4 full minutes. "Where'd you get this?" he said finally. It wasn't quite a question. Wade told him the short version. Frank turned the head over in his hands with the careful movements of someone who understood that he was holding something that had mattered to the person who made it. "Hand-ported," he said. "Every single chamber. This took months." He held it up to the shop light and looked along the intake port opening. This guy knew what he was doing. Better than knowing what he was doing, he had a theory and he executed it. He set it down on the bench. "What do you need from me?" "The 2 exhaust valve guides need to be reamed and rebushed. One intake seat is too far gone, needs a new insert. And I need a valve lapping done to the new geometry, which means you'll need to measure what he actually cut and work to that, not to any spec sheet." Frank looked at him. "You want me to figure out what he intended and match it?" "Yes, that's going to take time." "I know, and it'll cost accordingly." "I know that too," Wade said. He named a number that he'd calculated from what he had in the checking account after last month's bills. It was tight. Frank considered. He picked up the head again, turned it over, set it back down. "Do it for that," he said, "because I want to see it run." "Ma'am." April moved forward the way Ohio April did. 2 warm days, 1 cold day, rain that couldn't decide if it wanted to be winter or spring, mud on every unpaved surface, and a persistent gray ceiling over the valley that occasionally broke to show what the sky was actually capable of. Wade worked through it. The bodywork was the hardest part in terms of time. He'd decided early on that he wasn't going to fill the rust damage or hide it under filler. He was going to cut it out and weld in new metal, the way it should be done, the way Hollister would have done it if he'd had the chance. This was slower and more expensive and resulted in more than one evening where Wade sat on a stool and looked at the car and tried to figure out if he was being an idealist about it. He decided he was, and he decided to keep being one. Eli came into the garage most evenings, sometimes to help with small tasks, sometimes just to exist in the same space. He'd taken to bringing his homework out and doing it at the old card table Wade had set up near the wall heater, which was a habit that made approximately 0 educational sense, but which Wade couldn't bring himself to discourage, because the alternative was Eli alone in the house, and the garage at least meant they were in the same room. One evening in mid-April, while Eli was working on a book report about something Wade couldn't quite follow, Vic Sorensen stopped by unannounced. He came in through the side door, looked at the car on the lift with its new metal patches welded and ground smooth, and stood there a moment with his arms crossed. "Looking like something," he said. "Getting there." Vic crouched by the driver's side and looked along the rocker panel, where Wade had done 3 days' worth of metalwork. He ran his hand along the surface. "You know, Stahl filed a complaint with the county," he said, without turning around. Wade set down the grinder. "What kind of complaint?" "Disputed ownership claim. Challenging the validity of the sale from Harriman's yard on the basis of no documented title." Vic stood up. "It's civil, not criminal, and it's mostly paper right now, but it's on record." Eli had looked up from his homework and was watching them. "It's okay, buddy," Wade said to him, which was the kind of thing you said when you weren't entirely sure it was true. "Keep working." Eli looked at his father for a moment with Claire's eyes, assessing, then went back to his book. "The museum knows," Wade said, turning back to Vic. "Does their legal team know about this specific filing?" "Not yet." "Then call Bain tonight." Bain took the call at 8:30 in the evening, which said something about the man. Wade gave him the information. Bain was quiet for a moment, then said, "Our attorney anticipated something like this. In absence of documented title history, Ohio law on abandoned property and good faith purchase is fairly clear. Harriman sold you what he legally possessed, and you acquired it in good faith. Stahl's filing will be contested." Another pause. "It will cause delay, which is the point, but it won't prevail." "How long is the delay?" "A few weeks. Maybe a month at most if his lawyers push hard." Bain's voice was steady. "The authentication experts are scheduled for next week. 2 visits, mechanical expert first, historical documentation expert second. If those go as expected, I have what I need for the board meeting regardless of Stahl's filing."
He's trying to push me to settle privately before the board meeting. I know he is, Bain said. Don't. I'm not planning to. Good. Call me if anything escalates. Wade thanked him and hung up and sat in the kitchen. Through the wall, he could hear Eli getting ready for bed, the sound of the bathroom faucet, the familiar creak of the hallway floorboard that they'd both learned to step around and neither of them ever did. He was tired. The kind of tired that wasn't about sleep. He sat there until he heard Eli's door close, then went out to the garage and worked until midnight. The mechanical authentication expert arrived the following Tuesday. Her name was Carol Hessler. She was 55, a professor of automotive engineering at Ohio State with a specialty in mid-century American racing vehicle construction, and she had driven up from Columbus in a Subaru that had a parking permit from 3 different universities dangling from the rearview mirror. She came into the garage, shook Wade's hand with a firm grip, put on a pair of nitrile gloves she produced from her coat pocket, and began examining Ghost Rider without small talk. She worked for 4 hours. Wade stayed in the garage but kept to his own work area, answering questions when she asked them and otherwise staying out of her way. She had brought her own lights, a flexible inspection lamp that she ran along the chassis and into every corner she could access. And she made notes on a yellow legal pad with a mechanical pencil. At one point, she lay on her back on the creeper for 40 minutes without coming out. When she finally stood up and stripped off the gloves, she looked at Wade with an expression that he couldn't quite read. "The suspension geometry," she said. "Where did he develop this configuration?" "I don't know," Wade said. "His notes, if he had them, didn't survive with the car. He derived this himself." She wasn't asking. "I've been studying American independent constructors for 20 years. This geometry predates by nearly a decade the configuration that everyone credits to European teams in the early 80s. She picked up her legal pad and looked at her notes. He figured this out alone, in a workshop in rural Ohio, without any institutional resources. She set the pad down. The cylinder head work is equally remarkable. The port profiling alone, she paused. "Mr. Mercer, this is a legitimate historical artifact, not just historically interesting. Historically significant. There's a difference." "I know," Wade said. She looked at him. "You understood what you had. I understood it was good work. I understood the full extent of it gradually. Most people who found this would have sold it to the first person who offered real money. Most people aren't me," he said, not aggressively. "Just as a fact." She picked up her legal pad and made a final note. "My report to the museum will be clear and unambiguous. This vehicle is authentic." She looked at the car one more time. "Take good care of it." "That's the plan," he said. "What?" The second expert came the following week. His name was Gordon Parrish, a motorsport historian who'd written 3 books on American independent racing figures, and he was more talkative than Hessler, which wasn't hard. He spent most of his time with the documentation Wade had assembled, the photographs, the technical paper, the obituary, the forum material, and periodically asked Wade questions about Crow and about the conversation in the farmhouse. "Have you considered the possibility that Crow himself has documents?" he asked, sitting at the kitchen table with Wade's organized files spread around him. "I asked him. He said he had some materials from the period. He didn't specify." "I'd like to talk to him," Parrish said. "His testimony as a contemporary witness to Hollister's work is valuable beyond the physical evidence. It establishes the context, the disqualification, the decision to put the car away, the death before recognition. I'll call him and ask." "What's he like?" Wade thought about the farmhouse, the coffee, the photograph of Hollister on the wall. "He's still sad about it," Wade said. "After 50 years, he's still sad that his friend never got the recognition. I think he's been carrying that for a long time." Parrish looked at him for a moment. "That's something for the museum presentation to address," he said quietly. "The human story alongside the engineering story. They're not separate." "No," Wade agreed. "They're not." Parrish left in the late afternoon with photographs and copies of every document Wade had. His report, he said, would be ready within 10 days. Combined with Hessler's mechanical authentication, it would constitute a comprehensive provenance package. Wade walked back into the garage after his car pulled away and stood looking at Ghost Rider. The engine was back in the bay now. Frank Odom had delivered the machined head components the previous week, and the reassembly had taken Wade 3 evenings of careful work.
The engine was in, but not started. The exterior was about 60% restored. New metal patches welded in, a first skim of primer on the repaired sections. The interior was next. He was sourcing correct era materials for the seats, which was taking longer than everything else. It looked like a car now. Still rough, still far from complete, but recognizably itself. He put his hand on the hood. The metal was cold. He could feel the slight texture of the primer under his palm. "Getting there," he said to it, which he recognized was a ridiculous thing to say to an inanimate object. He said it anyway. Optic. The trouble with Stahl moved into a new register on a Thursday evening. Wade was coming out of Rooney's after a beer with Marcus and Ray when a man he didn't know fell into step beside him on the sidewalk. Not aggressively, just appeared, matching his pace, as if they'd been walking together all along.
Mr. Mercer. Mid-40s. Good coat. The particular kind of controlled friendliness that was actually a form of pressure. I represent a group of investors who are genuinely interested in a resolution that benefits all parties here. Wade kept walking. Which group? I'm not at liberty to... Then we're done, Wade said.
Mr. Mercer. The man stopped. Wade kept walking. Mr. Stahl is prepared to go to $700,000, cash, right now, this week. No authentication process, no board, no delay. Wade stopped. He turned around. He looked at the man in the good coat standing on the sidewalk in front of Rooney's in the Thursday night cold, with the neon beer sign reflecting in the wet pavement behind him. $700,000. He thought about Eli's winter coat. He thought about the VA paperwork. He thought about the mortgage and the utility bills and the 2 months of slow work during the winter that had put him behind on the truck payment. He thought about those things for exactly as long as it took him to remember why he was doing this, and that was not very long. Tell Stahl I've got a letter of intent with the museum, Wade said. Tell him the authentication is done and the provenance package is complete. Tell him the board meeting is in 3 weeks. He paused. And tell him if he wants to try to slow this down with legal filings, he's welcome to. But he's going to spend more on lawyers than he's going to gain, and in the end, the car is going into a museum where Hollister's name goes on the wall and everybody can see it. He let that land. Tell him that.
The man looked at him. The careful friendliness was gone now, replaced by the flat assessment of someone recalibrating. You understand you're walking away from... I understand everything I'm walking away from, Wade said. Good night. He walked to his truck and drove home. Marcus called him before he'd made it 2 miles. I saw that, he said, from across the street. You were watching. I'm always watching lately. What did he offer? 700. A silence. Wade? I know. That's real money. I know what it is, Wade said. He turned onto Garrett Street. His garage light was on, the way he'd left it. I know exactly what it is, and I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm fine, Marcus. Another silence. Okay, Marcus said. I'll take your word for it. How'd you know to be at Rooney's?
Because I know when guys like Stahl get to the point where the polite offers aren't working, Marcus said. They always try one more time in a semi-public place where they think you'll be alone. I figured Thursday was about right. A pause. You're not alone, Wade. I need you to keep knowing that. Wade pulled into his driveway and sat for a moment with the truck idling, looking at his house with the lights on inside. Eli would be in bed. The house would be warm. The garage would be cold, and the car in it would be waiting. I know, he said. I know I'm not. He killed the engine and went inside. The board meeting was 3 weeks out. In those 3 weeks, Wade finished the body restoration, sourced and installed correct era seat materials, and got the electrical system, Hollister's unconventional hand-wired configuration, tested and functional. The dash was restored with a reproduction gauge cluster that a specialist in Columbus had built to match the original specifications, because the original was beyond saving and there was no argument for putting something modern in its place. He painted it himself. He'd gone back and forth on the color for 2 weeks, looking at photographs of the car in the poor light of the scrapyard, trying to identify what the original had been. The deterioration and the rot of the tarp had made it ambiguous. He'd finally taken a sample from a protected section under one of the custom body panels, a section that had been sealed from air and moisture, and matched it with a paint specialist in Cleveland. The color was a very dark blue, not quite black. The kind of blue that looked black in low light and revealed itself only in direct sunlight. Appropriate, Wade thought. He sprayed it over 2 long weekends, in coats, with proper preparation between each one. Eli watched from the doorway on the second Sunday, the garage smelling sharply of paint thinner and lacquer, both of them wearing half masks because Wade wasn't casual about fumes around his kid. "It's dark," Eli said. "It's blue," Wade said. Eli looked at it. "It looks like night," he said. "Like the sky when there are no clouds." Wade looked at the car. The first top coat was down and drying, still flat from the gun, not yet buffed to its final surface. Even flat, even not quite finished, it had presence. It had the presence of something that had been waiting a long time to look like itself. "Yeah," he said. "It does." Eli looked at his father. "Are you happy, Dad?" he asked, which was the kind of question only kids asked, directly and without architecture, because kids hadn't yet learned to be afraid of what the honest answer might be. Wade thought about it seriously. "I think I'm getting there," he said. "I think things are going the way they should." Eli nodded, as if this was the correct and sufficient answer, and went back to his Saturday. The paint dried overnight. On Monday morning, in the cold early light, Wade opened the garage and looked at Ghost Rider under the shop lights for the first time fully painted. Dark blue, restored metal. The lines that Hollister had designed by hand now finally visible beneath the proper surface they'd always deserved. He stood there a long time without moving. Outside, a car passed on Garrett Street. A bird called from the oak tree in the backyard. The neighborhood made its ordinary sounds, indifferent to the fact that something significant was standing in a garage on its eastern edge. Wade got his phone and took one photograph. He didn't send it to anyone. He just wanted it for himself. Then he got to work on the final details, because there was still work to do and the board meeting was coming. And the thing that had started with $100 and a rusted shell and a rainy Thursday morning in a scrapyard was almost ready to show the world what it had always been. The board meeting was on a Thursday. Wade didn't attend. It wasn't his meeting, and Bain had been clear that the board preferred to deliberate without the seller present, which Wade understood. He spent the day in the garage doing work that didn't require much thought, the kind of repetitive mechanical task that kept his hands busy while his mind went wherever it needed to go. He replaced the brake lines on Denton's Triumph. He adjusted the carb on a Honda Shadow that had been running rich for a month. He swept the garage floor twice, which he never did. Eli came home from school and immediately read his father's face. "Did something happen?" he said. "Not yet. Waiting on something." Eli dropped his backpack and went to the refrigerator and got 2 sodas, one for himself, one for Wade, and set Wade's on the workbench without being asked. It was such a Claire gesture, so precisely the thing she would have done, that Wade had to look away for a second. "It'll be okay," Eli said, with the unearned certainty of a kid who had decided to believe something and wasn't going to be argued out of it. Bain called at 4:47. "The board approved," he said. $5 million, as discussed, subject to the transfer agreement we've already outlined. Our legal team will have draft documents to you by end of next week." Wade set down the wrench he'd been holding. "Okay," he said. "That's all you've got?" "Okay." "I'm trying not to make it weird," Wade said. Bain laughed, a short, real laugh. "There's one condition," the board added, minor, but I want to be transparent. They want the car running, not a static display. They want to be able to start the engine for special events, demonstrations. Is that feasible? "She'll run," Wade said. "She's already ready. I just haven't turned the key yet." "Then let's set a date." He turned the key on a Saturday morning with Eli standing 3 feet away and Marcus leaning against the garage door frame with his arms crossed and the expression of a man prepared for either outcome. The engine turned, caught, fired. It ran rough for the first 30 seconds. Decades of stillness working out of everything at once. The fuel system finding its rhythm, the oil pressure climbing where it needed to climb. Wade held the throttle steady and watched the gauges he'd set up on a temporary bench rig, his eyes moving from oil pressure to temp to the subtle telling quality of the exhaust note coming from the pipe he'd run out through the side door. Then the rough note smoothed. Not entirely. It would need tuning, proper road tuning with a wideband sensor and time. But the fundamental sound of it, the voice of what Hollister had designed, came through underneath the mechanical imperfections, and it was unlike anything Wade had heard from a comparable engine. A specific density to the sound, a purposefulness. Eli grabbed his arm with both hands and shook it. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Marcus said from the doorway, "Son of a gun." Wade let it run for 4 minutes, watching everything, listening, making mental notes. Then he killed the ignition and sat back on the stool and looked at the car in the sudden quiet, which wasn't entirely quiet because his ears were still ringing slightly, and the metal was ticking as it cooled, and somewhere outside a neighbor's dog was barking at the noise it hadn't understood. "She runs," Eli said. "She runs," Wade confirmed. Stahl made one final attempt the following Monday, not through a representative this time. Stahl himself appeared at the end of the driveway at 7 in the morning before Eli was up, in a black town car with a driver who stayed behind the wheel. He was shorter than Wade had imagined, mid-50s, compact, in the kind of suit that said money without shouting it. His face was the face of a man who had gotten what he wanted often enough to be genuinely surprised when he didn't. "I know about the board approval," Stahl said. He was polite about it, professional. "I want you to know I'm not here to threaten anything. The legal challenge will be dropped this week." Wade looked at him. "What are you here for?" "To offer you a better deal than what Bain gave you." He said it simply, without theater. $8 million, private transfer, no authentication circus, no museum politics, no board, straight transaction. "The deal is done," Wade said. "It's not signed yet." "It's done," Wade said again. Stahl studied him with the flat, measuring patience of someone running calculations. "You understand that 8 million is a real number. That's a different life for you and your son." "I understand that," Wade said. "I'm still saying no." "Why?" Not hostile. Genuinely curious, as if the answer might be something he could use. Wade looked at the garage door, at the house behind him, at the street that had been his street his whole life. That had been Claire's street. That was Eli's street. "Because some things are worth more than what someone will pay for them," he said. "And the people who understand that are the people I want to be like." Stahl held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once. Not in agreement, but in the way men acknowledge something they've heard and won't forget. "You're an unusual man, Mr. Mercer," he said. "I've been told," Wade said. The town car pulled away. Wade stood in the driveway until it turned off Garrett Street and disappeared, and then he went inside and made Eli breakfast and got him to school 7 minutes late, which Eli complained about the whole way there. The night before the transfer signing, Marcus and Vic and Ray and Pete came over. Nobody organized it. Nobody sent a group text. They just showed up, one by one, between 7 and 8 in the evening, until there were 4 bikes in the driveway and 4 men in the garage standing around Ghost Rider in the finished dark blue that looked like night sky under the work lights. Vic crouched by the front wheel and looked along the lower bodywork. Pete had his hands in his jacket pockets and his head tilted slightly, the posture of a man who was listening to something. Ray just stood there, looking at it the way people look at things they're trying to memorize. Eli was still up. It was a Friday. Wade had let it slide, and he came out and stood among them without anyone sending him away, because there was no reason to. He fit there. He'd always fit there. "It's really something," Pete said finally. Nobody argued with that. They stood there a while longer, not talking much, the radio playing its blues, the garage warm from the space heater against the May night that was still carrying some chill. 5 grown men and a kid, and a car that had been forgotten for 30 years and was leaving tomorrow. At some point, Marcus put his hand briefly on Wade's shoulder, just there, just for a moment, and then took it away without saying anything. That was enough. That was exactly enough. The signing happened on a Tuesday morning in a conference room at the museum's administrative offices, which smelled like carpet cleaner and old paper and the particular institutional quiet of a place that took its purpose seriously. Bain was there with the museum's legal counsel, a precise woman named Karen Aldrich, who had clearly read every line of the transfer agreement multiple times and had opinions about several of them. Wade had driven up alone, which Marcus had offered to come along for, and which Wade had politely declined, because this part he needed to do by himself. He read the agreement, all of it. Karen Aldrich watched him do it without impatience, which he appreciated. There were 2 pages of authentication certification, 3 pages of transfer terms, one page about the display conditions he'd insisted on, and a final page about the scholarship fund that he and Bain had discussed, and that the museum had agreed to administer, the Claire Mercer Memorial Scholarship for Emerging Automotive Technicians, which would support young mechanics from working-class backgrounds in obtaining formal technical credentials. He'd told Bain about Claire in about 4 sentences on the phone late one evening. Bain had been quiet afterward and then said, "That's the right name for it. Nothing more." Wade hadn't needed more. He signed where Karen Aldrich indicated. His handwriting on the signature line looked, as it always did, like a man who'd learned to write in conditions that weren't ideal and had never quite corrected the habit. He'd never been embarrassed by it until this moment, and then he decided not to be embarrassed by it, because the signature was what it was, and the document said what it needed to say. Bain shook his hand when it was done. "The transport crew comes Thursday," Bain said. "They'll treat it right. I've already told them twice." "Tell them a third time," Wade said. Bain smiled. "I already planned to." Wade drove home through late May Ohio countryside that had finally committed to being green. The hedgerows full and dark, the fields either planted or waiting to be, the sky a clear, functional blue that asked nothing of you except to notice it. He had the windows down. He had the radio on, something country, not his usual blues, but it fit the day. He thought about the number in his bank account, which had changed so dramatically overnight that he'd checked it 3 times that morning, and then closed the app because looking at it felt strange. Not bad strange, just the strangeness of a thing you'd been moving toward for months finally being real, which was different from how you'd imagined it while you were moving. He thought about what he was going to do with it. The mortgage paid off. That was the first thing, already arranged, a call his bank had seemed genuinely surprised to receive. The truck, also done. Eli's college fund started, something Wade had been meaning to do since before Claire died, and had never quite managed. The scholarship fund, seated with a separate amount that Bain had helped him structure properly for tax purposes, because this was the kind of thing that required doing correctly. What remained after all of that was still more money than Wade had ever imagined having at one time, and the fact of it sat with him in a way he was still getting used to. Not with discomfort, exactly. More with a kind of responsibility. The awareness that how you handled something said as much about you as how you got it. He already knew what he wanted to do with a portion of it. He'd known for a while. The transport crew came Thursday as Bain had promised, with a proper enclosed trailer and 2 men who moved the car with the careful efficiency of people who did this for a living and understood what they were handling. Wade watched them load it. He'd been dreading this part, the moment the car left the garage. And it was in fact hard, standing in the driveway watching the trailer door close on the dark blue bodywork and the clean lines that Hollister had designed by hand half a century ago. But it wasn't the kind of hard he couldn't stand. It was the right kind of hard. The kind that meant something important was actually happening rather than just being planned. Eli was home for this. Wade had kept him home from school for the morning, which Eli's teacher had been understanding about when Wade sent a brief note explaining the circumstances. Eli stood next to his father in the driveway and watched the trailer pull away. And when it turned off Garrett Street, he was quiet for a long moment. "It's okay," Eli said finally. To his father, not to himself. "I know," Wade said. "It's going somewhere people can see it." "That's exactly where it's going." Eli looked at the empty garage. The space where the car had been for months was visible in its absence. The clean patch of floor, the work light still hanging over nothing. He looked at it for a moment with that particular seriousness of his. "She'll still be Ghost Rider," he said. "Doesn't matter where she is." Wade put his arm around his son's shoulders, and they stood there looking at the empty garage together, and the May morning went on around them, ordinary and indifferent and full of light. The museum opening for the Hollister display was in September. 4 months felt like a long time, and then it didn't. The way time had been moving for Wade since Claire died, sometimes agonizingly slow, sometimes in sudden jumps, where he looked up and weeks had passed, and he couldn't account for them. He filled the summer with work, the same as always, but different in the specific way that doing work you don't desperately need changes the texture of the doing. He took 2 jobs he wouldn't have taken before because they interested him technically. He turned down 3 he didn't want. He bought Eli new school clothes in August without calculating twice, And the simplicity of that transaction, the complete absence of math in it, meant more to him than he could easily say. Marcus and Dana came for a cookout in July that lasted until 11 at night, which hadn't happened at Wade's house in longer than he could remember. Vic came through on a long ride and stayed 2 days, and they talked about things that had nothing to do with cars or money or dead engineers, which was also necessary and good. Ray and Pete sent occasional texts. The small network of people who had stood in his garage on a cold evening and looked at a car that wasn't finished yet and understood without asking. That network held the way it had always held, because some connections are made in conditions that calibrate them for the long term. Sandra Mack came over in August with another casserole, which had become something between them. Not exactly a friendship, but a kind of neighborhood honesty that was more real than most. She asked about the car, and Wade told her the full story, more than he'd told her before, and she listened without interrupting, which was new for her. "I said some unkind things," she said when he was done. "You were concerned," he said, which is what she'd said herself months ago. He meant it as acknowledgement, not absolution. "I didn't see what it was," she said. "I just saw what it looked like at the time." Wade looked at her. "Most people only see what something looks like," he said. "That's not a crime." She looked slightly relieved and slightly not, in the complicated way of people who are being let off a hook they feel they still owe something on. He understood that feeling. The scholarship received its first 5 applications in August, through the museum's administration. Bain sent him summaries, redacted, no names, and Wade read them carefully. Young people from small towns and mid-sized cities, mostly first generation for any kind of formal credentials, good with their hands, struggling with the institutional requirements of turning that into something sustainable. He'd been those people. He recognized them from the inside. The selection committee, which Bain had helped him establish with people who knew the field, would make the decisions. Wade had been clear about that. He didn't want to be the sole arbiter, because a single person's blind spots were too dangerous. But he read every summary. He wanted to know who the program was reaching. The museum opening was on a Saturday in mid-September, a week after Eli started 3rd grade. Damian Crow came. Wade had driven out to the farmhouse in Granville a week before to tell him in person, which felt like the right way to do it. The old man had listened, asked a few questions about the display, asked about what the plaque would say, and nodded slowly at the answers. Raymond would have argued with the wording, Crow said. He always argued with how things were worded. He thought precision mattered. What would he have changed? Crow thought about it. He would have wanted it to say what he was actually trying to do, not just that he built it, but why. He looked at Wade. He believed that American independent engineering was being crowded out by institutional money and institutional caution. He thought if you could prove something worked without all of that, just with thought and skill and stubbornness, you could change the argument. Did he change it? He didn't live long enough to know, Crow said. But you're putting his car in a museum 50 years after they threw him out of a race for it. I think the argument's been changed. Wade had taken that sentence back to Bain and asked him to work it into the display text. Bain had. It was on the wall now, in the museum, attributed to Crow, in the panel that told the full story of what Hollister had been trying to do and why it had mattered and what had happened to him. The opening was not a grand event. The museum was a serious institution, but not a large one, and the Hollister display was significant within its world without being the kind of thing that made news outside it. There were perhaps 60 people in attendance, museum members, a few journalists from automotive publications, the authentication experts, Bain's board, some people from the regional racing historical community, and a small number of general visitors who'd come in off the street because the museum was open and free that Saturday. Wade arrived with Eli and found the room before the formal presentation started. Ghost Rider was in the center of the display space on a low platform, under lighting that had been designed by someone who understood how to show a car. The dark blue paint, Hollister's blue, the night sky blue, responded to the lights the way it had responded to direct sunlight, by becoming exactly what it was, a surface that had been meant to be seen. Around the walls, the panels told the story. Photographs, documents, technical diagrams from the authentication experts showing the engineering innovations. The obituary, enlarged and framed, The SCCA protest document and the disqualification record, a photograph of Crow and Hollister together, which Crow had found in a box and given to Bain 2 weeks before the opening, both men in their 40s standing outside a workshop in bright light, Hollister squinting the same way he always squinted in photographs, Crow with his arm around his shoulder, and the plaque. Wade stood in front of it with Eli beside him and read it, even though he'd approved every word of it weeks ago. Raymond Francis Hollister, 1931 to 1974. Independent engineer and constructor. Built entirely by hand without institutional support, this prototype represents engineering solutions that were decades ahead of their time. Hollister was disqualified from the only race he entered because the vehicle's innovations could not be categorized by existing rules. He never saw his work recognized. He built this car because he believed that if you could prove something worked, the argument changed. He didn't live long enough to know, but the argument's been changed. Damian Crow, 2024. Below that, on a smaller plate, named Ghost Rider by Eli Mercer, age 8, who saw value where others saw only rust. Eli read his name on the wall and went very still. Wade watched him. Eli read it again slowly, running his eyes across the words, the way you reread something you need to be sure you're reading correctly. "That's me," Eli said. "That's you. It says my name." "It does." Eli turned and looked at his father. He had Claire's eyes, and he had some quality in his face that was entirely his own. Some combination of seriousness and openness that Wade had been watching develop since the boy was born and still couldn't quite name. "Mom would have liked this," he said. Wade's throat did what it did. He let it for a moment. "She would have loved it," he said. "She would have taken 17 pictures and made me stand in front of it." Eli almost smiled. "She always made you stand in front of things?" "She knew I wouldn't do it myself." They stood together in front of the plaque for a while longer. Around them, the room was filling up, people moving through the space, voices carrying the particular quality of people encountering something they hadn't expected to be moved by and finding themselves moved by it anyway. Wade heard someone near the technical panels saying, with genuine astonishment, "He derived this himself?" And he heard Hessler's voice answering, patient and precise, with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting for the general public to understand this for months. Crow appeared beside Wade. He moved slowly, with a cane he hadn't had the first time they met, and he looked at the car for a long moment before he spoke. "It's right," he said, simple. "I hope so." "It's exactly right." He looked at Eli. "You named it well, young man." Eli looked up at him seriously. "It was the right name," he said. "It looked like a ghost, but it was still there, still real. It just needed someone to see it." Crow looked at the boy for a moment. Then he looked at Wade. "Where did he get that?" he said. "I don't know," Wade said. "He's been like this since he was born." The old man made a sound that was approximately a laugh, low and short, and turned back to the car. After the formal presentation, Bain speaking briefly and well, Hessler giving a 5-minute technical summary that somehow held the room's attention completely, Crow saying 3 sentences that were better than anything else said that day. Wade found himself standing alone near the back of the room while Eli had drifted to the technical panels with the focused attention he applied to things that interested him. Gordon Parrish, the motorsport historian, came to stand next to him. "How does it feel?" he asked. Wade thought about the question seriously. He'd been asked versions of it several times today by different people, and he'd given various sufficient answers, but Parrish was asking it in the way of someone who wanted the actual answer rather than the comfortable one. "Strange," Wade said. "Good strange, but strange." He looked at the car. "I spent 6 months with it in my garage. Every night after my kid went to sleep, I was in there working on it. Just me and this machine and whatever I was thinking about." He paused. "Now it's in a museum and there are 60 people in the room, and it's better this way. It's absolutely better this way. But there's a part of it that's mine that I had to let go of to get here. That's what it costs to do the right thing with something," Parrish said. "You don't get to keep it the same way." "I know, I made peace with it." "Did you?" Wade looked at him. "Mostly," he admitted. Parrish nodded. "That's an honest answer." He looked at the car. "For what it's worth, in 30 years of writing about this field, I've met a lot of people who found significant things. Most of them did what Stahl wanted you to do. Not because they were bad people, because the money was real and the alternatives were abstract. He paused. You knew what you had and you knew what it deserved. That's not common. Wade didn't answer that. He wasn't sure it was a compliment he'd earned exactly. He'd had bad nights. He'd had moments. The $700,000 offer, the 3 in the morning when the VA paperwork was still sitting undone and the truck payment was 2 weeks late, where he'd had to actively choose to not do the easier thing. He didn't think that made him better than people who chose differently. He thought it made him someone who'd gotten clear enough about what he was doing and why to hold the line when it cost something. That wasn't virtue. That was just knowing yourself well enough at the right moment. He thought about Claire, who had known him better than he knew himself for most of the years they'd had together, and who had pushed him toward clarity in the way she always had, not by telling him what to do, but by asking the right questions until he got there himself. He missed her every day. The missing didn't get smaller, he'd found. It got more familiar. You learned to carry it in a way that didn't prevent movement, and that was different from it being lighter. He looked at Eli across the room, still at the technical panels, now talking to Carol Hessler with the focused intensity of someone finding a subject they cared about. And he thought, this is what she would have wanted me to do. Not the specific car, not this specific moment, but this. Being present for it. Doing the thing that mattered over the thing that was easy. Raising the kid in a way that she could recognize. He thought he was doing okay at it. Not perfectly. Some nights were still hard, and some mornings he still woke up disoriented and reached for a warmth that wasn't there. He still lost his patience with Eli occasionally in ways he regretted. He still sometimes sat in the empty garage too late because the house was too quiet. But he was doing okay. That was what he had. Okay, most of the time, with good days and bad days and a kid who named things correctly and a group of men who showed up without being asked, and the memory of a woman who had loved him when he wasn't sure he deserved it. That was enough. Not everything, but enough. Orsan. They left the museum at 4 p.m. when the event was winding down and Eli had finally exhausted his questions for Carol Hessler, who had given him her card and told him to email if he thought of more, which Wade suspected Eli would take her up on before the week was out. In the parking lot, Marcus and Dana were waiting by their bikes. Vic was there, and Ray, and Pete, and 2 other guys Wade hadn't seen in years. Former unit members who had apparently gotten word through Marcus's network that something was happening and had decided to be there for it. The bikes were lined up in the late September light, and the men stood by them with the easy, worn comfort of people who had been in each other's company through worse things and didn't need reasons to show up. Dana hugged Eli and gave him a wrapped package that turned out to be a book about American racing history that was clearly not a children's book and was clearly not accidental. For when you're ready for it, she said. Eli looked at it with the expression of someone who had already decided he was ready for it. Wade looked at his people in the parking lot, the leather, the bikes, the faces that had been through the particular education that certain kinds of experience provide, and he thought about what Raymond Hollister had believed, that if you could prove something worked, the argument changed. That stubbornness in service of something real was not the same as stubbornness in service of pride. That what you built was a statement about what you thought was possible. He thought about a $100 car in a scrapyard on a gray Thursday morning, about rust and 30 years of silence, about a kid who pressed his hand flat against a ruined body panel and felt something worth naming. He thought about the fact that nobody had shown up here for the money. Not Marcus, not Vic, not any of them. They'd shown up because Wade was one of theirs, and something he'd done mattered, and they wanted to be present for that. That was the whole reason. There was no more complicated version. Some things really were that simple. Marcus came over and stood next to him, looking at the museum entrance where the last of the event attendees were still trickling out into the afternoon. "You good?" Marcus said. "Yeah," Wade said. "I'm good." "Really good? Or the thing where you say you're good?" Wade looked at him. "Really good." Marcus looked at him for a moment, assessing with the accuracy of someone who had known him since they were both 22 and had never quite lost the ability to read him correctly. "Okay," he said. "Then let's go." They rode back toward Kellerton in the September light, Marcus and Vic and Ray and Pete, and the 2 guys whose names Eli was still learning. A loose formation on the highway, Not organized, just moving in the same direction, the sound of the engines a kind of language that didn't need translation. Wade drove the truck with Eli in the passenger seat, and the book about racing history already open on his lap. They passed the turnoff for Route 12. 8 miles east was Harriman's scrapyard, where a man named Phil had sold Wade a rusted car for $100 on a gray morning in March because it was taking up space he needed. Wade didn't turn. He didn't need to go back to it. But he noticed it as he passed. He noticed it the way you notice the place where something started when you're finally far enough along to see the whole distance. The bikes moved on ahead, their taillights flickering as the highway curved. Eli turned a page. The Ohio countryside held them, wide and late green and familiar, the kind of landscape that didn't ask anything of you except to keep moving through it. Wade kept moving. The sun was going down somewhere behind the cloud cover, turning everything a low, warm amber that made even the tired parts of the valley look like something. The kind of light that didn't last, but while it lasted, it was honest and clear, and it showed you things exactly as they were. He drove home.